Welcome to the D6 Family Ministry Podcast, a place where ideas, principles, and personalities come together to give you a ministry advantage that empowers the church and home.
I don't know anything more important in our society or in the kingdom of God than to help the church, help the family.
Discipleship is not an event, it's a way of life.
And one day it just hit me that discipleship at home was not about doing more. It was about inviting Christ into what we were already doing.
The goal of family ministry is not families sitting on the couch holding hands and singing Kumbaya. The ultimate goal is families that love God, love people, and make disciples of all peoples.
So that's why you're here. You're here to say 1 hour a week, as significant and as awesome as it is, we know that it's not enough and we want to be intentional with every hour.
You're listening to the D6 Podcast. Here are your hosts, Marianne Howard, Ron Hunter, and Josh Wooten.
Well, our guest today brings up a really, really important topic of helping kids with anxiety disorders. And he lists off just some characteristics throughout the interview. So before we get into this interview, I wanted us to have a little fun discussion about, he brings up rule following and attaches that to some anxiety disorders. So I would like to know from you guys, do you have the propensity to follow the rules? And yes or no? And based on your answer, were you always that way? Did that ever change? How would you answer that question?
I would say nowadays, yes, I am a rule follower. In my younger days, of course, no. Up until the point I was like 21, I was probably not be considered a very much a rule follower. I like to push the limits and test the boundaries. But now I am a rule follower to the letter, and drives my sweet bride crazy because, believe it or not, she is not quite the rule follower. She doesn't think they all apply to her, or she doesn't think that the rule makes complete sense in the way that she is viewing a particular circumstance at that time, and she may circumvent the rule for the greater good of Lena.
The great good of Lena. I know Lena, and I'm processing all of that because she drives 45 miles an hour, whether or not the speed limit's 65 or whatever. So I would
That's a whole other podcast.
I know it is a whole other podcast. Okay, Marianne, for me, when I was younger, I definitely was a rule follower. I was a nerd rule follower. Doesn't mean I didn't get away with things, but I was generally the young boy who the teachers thought was, quote, perfect, even though my friends knew I was not. So I had the appearance of it. As I got older, I'm a recovering legalist. Therefore, I really challenged the rules and the status, not for the sake of being rebellious, but I want to follow the rules that make sense. And the ones that don't are absurd. And I have challenged systems. I was once, one of the things one of my dear friends often talks about, I was going through the Dallas airport and the security lines made no sense the way they flowed. I got through them. I asked to speak to the supervisor and I told him how it should be set up. And a week later, when we flew out of there, they had set it up the way I had proposed it. They had actually rearranged the lines in the stanchions to make it flow better. I just like analyzing the systems that are in there, but I'm not just rebellious for the sake of being rebellious. Yeah. How about you, Marianne? I have predictions on your answers, and I'd love to hear these.
Oh gosh. I actually deal with anxiety. I've shared that on the podcast before. It's something that's kind of been in me for as long as I can remember, and there's a lot of reasons as to why they're there. I think it's an interesting question. So which goes to my answer. I do like rules because they feel protective and it helps me know what to expect. And I'm an expector. I'm one who visions forward and thinks forward. So I want to know what to expect up there. And when I can't gauge that, I find it difficult sometimes to navigate. However, as I've gotten older, I want to ask why there's a rule I'll follow it, but I want to understand it. Kind of what you're saying. I don't necessarily need it to make sense to me so much, like your brain wants to understand, like those lines don't make sense to me kind of thing. To me, it's not even necessarily that it has to completely make sense to me. I just want you to give me a reason. Like I do want to ask why. I'll honor it. I just want to understand it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Do you see that?
I do. And I'm going to tell you that at the age I am, my parents' generation expected obedience without explanation.
Mm,
And I think that contributed to rebellion. And as a result, I think we grew up not knowing why we had to do something. Therefore, we didn't adopt the item. And as a result, we didn't make those decisions for ourselves. We simply followed the decisions our parents made, thus walking away from them.
yeah.
I think it's problematic. But going back, and let's unpack this on the other side of Dr. Steve. As I listened to him and the banter here, I realized I might fit into certain categories of anxiety that I didn't realize I actually possessed.
Hmm.
And
Can't wait to hear this.
yeah, I might need a trip to his office to have some conversations. I'm not sure here, but he certainly, I think I have the most notes from this interview of most any interview I've listened to in a couple of years. I'm not saying it's better than all the others, but I learned so much and so insightful. So let's take a listen. And I can't wait to get therapy from Josh and Marianne on the other side of this.
Introducing D6 Everyday Foundations, strengthening the building blocks of faith. We are thrilled to announce the launch of D6 Everyday Foundations, a groundbreaking curriculum designed to empower churches and families in their journey of faith. This innovative program aims to align the church and home, fostering a strong foundation and unshakable confidence in God's Word. D6 Everyday Foundations boasts a comprehensive 3-year scope, focusing on major themes and characters from the Bible while also addressing pertinent cultural issues. With this curriculum, we aim to equip individuals of all ages to stand firm in their faith and navigate the challenges of our ever-changing world. At the heart of D6 Everyday Foundations is a church and home partnership, recognizing the vital role both play in nurturing and cultivating a vibrant faith. Through this collaboration, families will be empowered to prioritize and emphasize God's Word in their daily lives. Together, let's lay the foundation for a generation grounded in truth and empowered to impact the world around them. Let's hold the building blocks of faith firmly in place. To order D6 Everyday Foundations and embark on this exciting journey of faith, visit d6family.com today.
Right now, I am joined by Dr. Steve Grcevich. Dr. Grcevich is a child and adolescent psychiatrist and president of Key Ministry, an organization dedicated to helping churches welcome families of kids with disabilities, with a special focus on emotional, behavioral, developmental disabilities, and trauma. He's the program chair for Disability and the Church, an annual event representing the largest disability ministry conference in the U.S. Dr. Steve, thanks for joining us today.
Well, thanks so much for having me. I appreciate the opportunity to share with the D6 family.
Well, it's an honor to finally get to talk to you. We've communicated through email, we've communicated through Twitter when it was Twitter, now X when it's X. Some of it's been discussing mental health. Some of it has been discussing baseball and our sadness over what's been going on. So it's cool to see this finally come full circle and get to sit down and talk. And today we're talking about a topic that's it's so important for the church. It's so important for the world. And that's helping kids with anxiety disorders to grow spiritually. To kind of get us started, how many kids are dealing with some type of anxiety disorder today?
So there were estimates during COVID that 20 to 30% of the school-age population was struggling with anxiety. The reality is that that the actual figure in terms of kids who have significant enough impairment that they probably need some help with it is somewhere between 8 to 12%. So this is the most common mental health condition that we see in adolescence. And it's pretty close to ADHD in terms of being like the most common condition that we would see in school-age kids. Why I think it's particularly relevant to your audience is that there was a very large study that was published about 5 years ago looking at the impact that different disabilities have, disabilities in kids on family church attendance. I mean, this is over 250,000 interviews from 3 waves of the National Children's Health Survey. And so one of the things that they had noted is that, well, it'd be no surprise to people listening to a podcast like this, that when a family has a kid with autism, it reduces the likelihood of them setting foot in a church by 84%.
Wow.
But it's 73% if you have a kid with depression. It's 55% if you have a kid with a disruptive behavior disorder, oppositional defiant disorder, conduct disorder. But it's 45% for families who have a kid with an anxiety disorder. And when you think about the fact that that's 10%, of the adolescent population in the United States, and they have parents and siblings who miss out on being a part of church because, some of the struggles that the child or children in a family have dealing with anxiety when it comes to, like entering in the environments where we do ministry at church. Arguably, mental health conditions in general and families impacted by mental illness are arguably the largest underserved population by the church in North America. And out of all of the different mental health conditions that impact church attendance, anxiety impacts the most people.
Do you think people are staying away from the church because the church isn't equipped to deal with this, or are they scared that the church isn't equipped to deal with this?
So a way of thinking about it, when you look at some of those statistics around mental health, is that if you look at it from the perspective of like a cultural model of disability, there are certain things that we expect of people when they act and interact with one another at church. And there are certain attributes that are common in these mental health conditions that make it a lot more difficult for kids and families to meet those expectations. For example, churches are intensely social places. So if you have a condition where you tend to overestimate the level of risk when you're meeting new people, when you tend to misinterpret how you are viewed by other people, when small groups are a key component of discipleship and you have a condition that makes you intensely uncomfortable with self-disclosure, you can see why church would be a struggle for these kids.
Yeah, that's something I hadn't really thought of, but then I'm thinking about placing myself in some of those social situations where I have felt awkward and uncomfortable, and so I know there's people dealing with it a much more, times 100 from what I'm dealing with. Now, anxiety doesn't always look the same, and so if you're just looking in a crowd, you're not going to look out and go, oh, well, then those 6 people have anxiety. Like, you can look out and say, well, those 6 people have brown hair, but anxiety doesn't look that way. How can we recognize anxiety in our children, whether it's my kid or whether it is kids in our church?
So if we're looking at this in general and the kinds of things that parents should be on the look for, one of the things that we see a lot with kids is that they ask lots of questions that start with what if. So oftentimes, that they're looking to parents and they're looking to other adults for reassurance. One of the things that you see is that oftentimes, because in response to sort of their own internal feelings of anxiety, their circulation gets flooded with stress hormones, a lot of these kids have a lot of vague physical complaints that don't necessarily have a clear medical cause. My head hurts. My stomach hurts. I don't feel good. Muscle aches, dizzy, weak, lightheaded. So these are kids maybe who end up in the nurse's office more than what you would expect, or maybe they miss more school than what you'd expect. But on the other hand, like when you think about kids who sometimes struggle significantly from an emotional standpoint at home or in a school setting, oftentimes kids who are angry, moody, irritable, emotional, a lot of times that's driven by anxiety, because one of the common characteristics we see in kids with anxiety is that they tend to ruminate a lot. When something starts to bother them, they have a propensity to think and think and think about things and have a very hard time letting stuff go. And oftentimes the way that ends up being manifest is in, severe irritability, moodiness, and anger. So lots of times when you see kids who, come across as angry, defiant, disrespectful, it is oftentimes a sign that they're dealing with a fair amount of underlying anxiety.
Well, I mean, the obvious question to ask now is, what can the church do? What can the church do to make the environment more welcoming and maybe to take a little of the edge off, take the anxiety off for kids who are struggling with this?
So one of the things that our team developed, and the folks at Zondervan published a book about 6 years ago that we developed, book's called Mental Health in the Church, but basically developed a model that churches of all sizes and denominational backgrounds could use to think about mental health inclusion. And so coming back to this cultural model of disability that we described, part of what we would recommend that teams would do in churches, and this is very much an issue that calls for a family ministry oriented approach, because about a half an hour into child psychiatry school, I, realized that the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. And a lot of times these kids with anxiety are struggling with parents with anxiety.
Yeah.
But so part of what, when we're working with churches that we would train them to do is that, across the different ministry silos, and preferably like throughout all the ministries of the church that impact the family, think about, are there certain non-essential components of our church culture that we can modify in different ways to make it easier for folks, to be able to join with us, for worship, for fellowship, for Christian education, for service. And so in the model that we developed, there are 7 different barriers that are common for folks who have, mental health conditions. One is stigma. Anxiety is probably the most significant one. We also would talk about, kids who, again, maybe struggle with emotional self-regulation. Sensory processing issues are common in kids with anxiety, which is something that people typically associate, with kids on the autism spectrum. Social communication is an issue. Again, like if you're so anxious that you start missing social cues, body language, facial expressions, and in general, you are misinterpreting how you're being pursued by other people, social interactions become challenging. Social isolation is an issue, because a lot of times kids who are anxious aren't involved in all of the extracurricular activities that bring parents together and, bring families together with other families who are going to your church, where they have the kinds of relationships where they can get invited to church. And then the 7th barrier that we talk about oftentimes is past experience of church. So that, at your conference, one of the things I heard people talking about, from the main stage is families and kids who are de-churched. When we did our first big conference, which was virtual before it was in person, like 10 years ago, 64% of the folks who had registered for the conference had to leave their church and go to another church because a family member, struggled significantly or had a bad experience. So that's the issue with a lot of these families, that they may have been somewhere before, but because things didn't go well or they were misunderstood or something wasn't handled properly with the child, they fell away, or situations where the family moves, but because the child might be intensely uncomfortable in a new or unfamiliar situation, it makes it hard. One of the examples I think would resonate with your audience that we use when we go around to train churches is that, talk about a hypothetical family, single mom, 9-year-old son, 6-year-old daughter. They live down the street from your church. The 9-year-old son was invited by a friend to VBS, loved it, wants to come every Sunday. Mom has social anxiety and agoraphobia. The 9-year-old son has ADHD and dyslexia, and his 6-year-old sister has separation anxiety. Think about everything that could possibly go wrong the first time that family tries to visit church. First off, mom has probably watched several of your services online and has been all over your website to see and understand how people dress, because the last thing that she would want to do is either herself or have her kids looking differently than other people there, or doing anything that would cause them to become a focus of attention. How many of your extremely friendly and gregarious greeters does mom have to deal with on her way into the building? How many folks does she have to interact with in the process of registering both of her kids, for your programming? What happens when her 6-year-old daughter finds out that she's expected to be with the other girls in the first grade and that mom won't be sitting with her the entire time? So by the time you get through all the registration, mom gets to your sanctuary, your worship center, and there are only middle seats available in the first 4 rows, for a person who's prone to anxiety attacks when they're in situations where it's hard to leave without drawing a lot of attention to themselves. When you start thinking about this and just the different practicalities and challenges that families sometimes face, it's not hard to understand why they're so underrepresented at church.
Yeah, you made me think back to when I was in middle school, and there was a friend I kept inviting to church over and over and over, and he kept saying no, 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 no. And finally he said to me, I kind of want to come, but I'm too nervous because I don't know when we're supposed to stand up, when we're supposed to kneel, when we're supposed to get up. And I thought, buddy, we're not Catholic, we're Baptist. Like, you don't have to worry about that. But that's what he had in his mind. And so he didn't come. But then he was also worried about, do I need to go buy new clothes? Are the clothes I have okay? I did not realize he was going through it, and I realized I had not communicated properly to him. Once I put him at ease, and he was able to come, and it was better. But like you said, I had no idea what was going on in his mind. But him and his mom, they were so worried about that what you just walked through, that scenario is so great, because I think we forget about that. We're going to take a quick break, but when we come back, we're going to keep talking about this because you're hitting on so many practical things that I think we forget about or we don't think about, and we need to. So we'll be right back.
Attention all ministry leaders, counselors, and compassionate souls. Are you seeking to make a real difference in the lives of those grappling with emotional pain, addiction, or crisis? Your guide has arrived. Introducing First Aid for Anxiety by Dr. Edward E. Moody Jr. Dr. Moody, a seasoned counselor, pastor, and educator, offers his profound insights in this groundbreaking book. With over 3 decades of experience in helping others, he's here to guide you through the maze of emotional and mental health challenges. First Aid for Anxiety is not just a book, it's a comprehensive toolkit. It provides an extensive list of resources and contacts for professional help, offering an excellent overview of situations faced when aiding someone suffering from emotional issues, addiction, and mental health crises. Order your copy of First Aid for Anxiety today. Visit d6family.com.
We're back. We're talking to Dr. Steve about helping kids with anxiety disorders to grow spiritually. We've kind of looked at the things that we really need to think through as a church to make sure that our churches are friendly to those dealing with some type of anxiety disorder. I want to talk about discipleship a little bit, because anxiety can make discipleship a little bit more challenging, but it doesn't make it impossible. What are some approaches we can take that will help us disciple those kids who are really struggling?
So one of the issues when you start thinking about things that like a team at a church can do to make kids more comfortable is that one of the things we know about kids and adults with anxiety is that basically their brains are hardwired to overestimate the level of risk in new situations. So that, for example, one of the things you might notice with kids with anxiety is, if you want to figure out who they are in your church, go into the worship center 20 minutes after the service has started and look and see who is regularly there but sitting with their parents. That's probably a pretty good tip-off. But some of the kinds of things that are really helpful, like especially like, let's say you want a kid to go on a mission trip, or you're doing like a student retreat. One of the ways of helping kids with anxiety to participate is when you're doing this, put as much video, as many pictures as you can of what kids can anticipate and what they're going to be doing, on your YouTube, on your website, on your Instagram, if you're doing TikTok on TikTok, because one of the ways of overcoming some of that anxiety is the more kids can visualize of what they're going to experience, the easier it will be for them to enter into some of those environments. Now, one of the things, when we start talking about like some specific discipleship challenges, one of the things that is sometimes an issue for kids who wrestle with this is that they tend to be rule followers. So that legalism, is one of the things that they might struggle with. That we see that they have a propensity that they have a hard time maybe enjoying a relationship with Jesus because they're constantly doing for Jesus. A lot of these kids, because they're so conscientious, these are your valedictorians, they're your high achievers. When I am interviewing prospective medical students, they are very much disproportionately represented because they're the kids who are up till 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning studying for their tests because they're worried about something that they might have forgotten. One of the biggest challenges when I think about kids who end up in a practice like mine are that the biggest Christian-specific challenge I'm approached with are kids who start to question their salvation. There's a kid that I've seen recently who, is tormented by the idea that he committed the unforgivable sin. I go, if you're worried about committing the unforgivable sin, you didn't commit it, because if you did, you wouldn't care about it. Yeah. So those are some of those are some of the challenges that that we'll see with kids when they're wrestling with this stuff. Another reason why a family ministry approach is especially important. Think about COVID. The way that kids learn how to manage anxiety is by watching their parents manage anxiety. And, when they see their parents, like, being able to put their faith into practice, and, using biblical principles, falling back on scripture, falling back on different spiritual disciplines, when they're dealing with a difficult situation, kids learn from that. Part of why we saw the big spike, in anxiety during COVID is that these kids watched their parents freak out and as a result had difficulty with it themselves. So that, I think that there's a great opportunity here, like thinking about parents as partners, that with kids with anxiety, if we can help parents understand and model for their kids how to apply their faith, in the course of some of the day-to-day challenges that they have, it can be really helpful. That one of the verses that kids and families and adults with anxiety oftentimes, wrestle with is like the Philippians 4:6-7. Mm-hmm. Be not anxious in anything, but in everything by prayer and petition. Well, a way of thinking about that is that I also see kids who struggle, well, if I feel so bad, like, why doesn't God take it away? Well, one of the ways I'll talk about this with kids is turn your anxieties into prayers. And that perhaps one of the reasons why, this isn't something that God takes away is that by cultivating sort of a habit of turning to Him in distress and seeking the Lord out in prayer, He's drawing you into a closer relationship with Him. And that from God's perspective, the quality of that relationship He has with each of us is a lot more important to Him than our level of comfort in the moment. And so, if you think about it as something, if you think about it as, in a sense, as like almost like a thorn in the flesh that draws you closer to God, that's a different way of thinking about it than to assume that the reason why you're struggling with anxiety is because you don't have enough faith in God. And one of the things that a lot of kids like this struggle with greatly is that in the same way that they misinterpret how other people view them, they will misinterpret how God views them, and tend to view God as more judgmental and less merciful.
Well, Dr. Steve, I appreciate you sharing this with us. I was thinking back today, 2018, I'm sitting in my office. There's this brown box that appears on my desk. Don't know what it is. I open it up, and there's a book in there called Mental Health and the Church. And that was the first time I had been introduced to you, and I started flipping through it and kept flipping through it, and I did not stop till I finished going through that entire book. It made such a difference in me that I immediately connected with you because I thought this is such a needed resource. And I appreciate what you've shared today. And I want to plug your book. You did not ask me to do that one bit, but it made such a big difference on me as a dad, as someone working in a church, just as a Christian. I think it would transform a lot of lives out there, and it will open some eyes. Check out that book, Mental Health in the Church. But thank you for sharing this. This is something we need to be talking about more and more, and you've given a lot of practical suggestions that we really need to think about as churches, so thank you for sharing this today.
Well, thank you so much, and I so appreciate what your team at D6 is doing in terms of calling attention to these issues and pointing church leaders to resources that they can use to effectively minister with these kids who are struggling.
Thank you so much.
That was so incredibly helpful. As somebody who has struggled with anxiety from in the past, at one particular time, most people look at me and think, wow, that's the most confident guy in the room. You can throw me in front of 500 people with a microphone that I didn't know and give me a subject and go, you got 15 minutes. I feel like I could figure it out. It wouldn't even freak me out. But I experienced some PTSD at some point and found myself struggling with a lot of these things that he spoke of. And it was so nice to find others that have been down the path before me, and people like Dr. Steve, who devoted his life to helping those that deal with that struggle, because it's hard to put your finger on it while you are going through it. And it was just very helpful. And I think one of the things that he really that spoke to me is, he said that parental modeling plays a crucial role in how your children manage their anxieties and perceive God, and so show is better than tell. Your kids are going to do what you do, not what you tell them to do.
Yeah.
Right.
I appreciated this area we talked about things you can't see in a previous episode. And this kind of fits in that category. And he made it so simple to help us recognize anxiety with asking certain questions, making certain observations. And I'm like, oh, wow. And I might not know what they're battling, but now I know they're battling, which tells me why they're acting out or why they're reserved or retreating or any number of items. Man, Dr. Steve, I cannot say thank you enough for helping us understand why we're experiencing what we are and helping to better engage, love, and gracefully navigate that. Marianne, your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I am really sitting with his statement about our brains are hardwired to overestimate risk. For me personally, I think I live there. And I think a lot of, this is a sensitive topic because I think it's a real battle internally, but I think it's sorry to be emotional, but I think it's hard to watch your children struggle with it. I think that's just to be, really transparent. It's been hard to watch by one of my own children be that kid that gets overwhelmed at church. And um, Dr. Steve really helped me understand why. My husband's a pastor, his dad's a pastor, he's known the church all his life. And but we can just kind of shove them into the classroom, not thinking about everything that's happening to them as they're because of how they're wired as we pull up to the church and walk them in. And so he brought such awareness. This one will be listened to by all of our staff and volunteers in our faith community, because I think we need to be really careful how we're engaging people that are coming to our congregations. There's a lot going on internally. There are some people that are coming to our faith communities, they're overcoming so much internally just to come and sit and be there. And I think we just need to be sensitive to that. I'm sorry.
No, nothing to be sorry for. I was processing. I don't know where you are with one of your kiddos, and I'm not prying, but again, this took me back to Holly Girth and being an introvert.
Yeah.
And when he said churches are social and people tend to misinterpret your condition
Yeah.
because maybe you're not social. I mean, I love church, but I can walk in right at the start of service intentionally in order to avoid the chit chat,
Yeah.
find my place, and then leave and have minimal interaction as an introvert in that larger setting, but then go to my small group, which is second hour, and I'll have the most fun conversations in a group of 15 or 18 people. And, you would think I'm a total extrovert, but I'm so reserved. I want those protected areas.
Yeah.
And
Didn't you
I don't know. I feel bad about that I'm dodging certain areas.
but I think didn't you just love how he gave the solution about over communication for certain people? Just
Yeah.
as leaders, we're all three leaders, leading
Yeah.
people, leading staffs, leading volunteers, leading students. I
Yes.
love that he used the little example of youth pastors, children's pastors capture videos. Those camp videos, they
Right.
help my what if kid
That's
who
right.
is going to camp for the first time and needs to see it
That's
to
right.
choose to go and take that risk. It's just like you said, our brains are hardwired to overestimate it. Well, what are people overestimating when they pull into the parking lot? We want to have all these greeters and have all these people welcoming people at the door, but that overwhelms some personalities.
Yes. Yes.
I just loved how he gave us some tangible things to think about it as we communicate. And I mean, to the three of us just right here having this open conversation, what friends of ours, what coworkers of ours do we need to lean into and pay attention to that are withdrawn, that may not speak up because of the internal, they've got value. There's things
Yeah.
that they bring to the table that we may miss because they don't assert.
Yeah.
Anyway,
Let's take your family for a moment.
Okay.
For the listeners, how many kiddos do you have?
I have two.
You have two. So you have one who is going to question and wonder what's going to happen when they don't have all the details.
Yeah.
So Dr. Steve mentioned that we might lose a family of four who's trying to protect that one family member. And you
Yeah.
know what? That's what they're supposed to do, is protect. But
That's right.
could we change what we do at church to help that family find comfort and a safe entry into that experience?
Yeah. That's
Yeah,
powerful.
it really is. Josh,
Word.
closing words, friend.
Well, I think it's like the old saying, everybody is, fighting a battle that you know nothing about sometimes. And I think us being mindful of that, being mindful of those who may not be the most outspoken and extroverted people within our church communities and our church families, but their worth is not dependent on their, outward appearance or anything, that we need to keep our eyes open. I think Marianne hit the nail on the head. All the staff needs to hear that talk, that interview. And I think it's very important, even for greeting teams, to recognize, our over the topness can drive some way, and being mindful to go, okay, pick up on the social cues of that person and just say, hey, I get it. I can be a lot sometimes. That right there was a game changer for me, just because I am that personality. So I just encourage you, listen again, take notes, talk with your staff, your volunteers, and let's work on making our churches a welcoming community for those who struggle with anxiety and other mental disorders that we may not know that they're struggling with.
Yeah. Dr. Steve, thank you for a very heavy, but yet a very relieving way of dealing with this topic. You certainly minister to all three of us. It's obvious. Next week, we're going to go into a little bit lighter territory and how we can write our own story for the sake of the generations who follow, especially our family. We'll be with Eric Thompson, and it's going to be a fun topic. We'll see you next week.
You've been listening to the D6 Podcast. You can learn more about D6 at d6family.com.